Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Cancel Vacation. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a social justice, social media mob looking to cancel her in this all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Cancel Vacation in paperback and e-readers today. A couple of weeks ago, I made a live stream talking about baby boomers' fear of their own mortality. And in that stream, I talked about how your boomers today are making remakes and reboots of old concepts because they are afraid of passing away and being forgotten. Now, an example of this took place last week when director Steven Spielberg decided to do a remake of the 1961 musical West Side Story. Now, your Steven Spielberg is a baby boomer, and most boomers remember your West Side Story very fondly, and many boomers see it as a classic musical. So many of your boomers want to go out here and relive the past. However, many of those boomers just don't understand how much the world has changed since your West Side Story was put on Broadway back in 1957, or when it was adapted into a film in 1961. Now, over 60 years have passed since West Side Story was the number one movie of 1961, and it won 10 Oscars. And in the 60 years that have passed since West Side Story came out, the entire community of the Bronx, or Harlem, where this was set, has completely changed. And your people like your Steven Spielberg, they're thinking that because this film was a classic for many years, that the audience would still connect to it in the same way. However, the audience that watched West Side Story in 1961 is not the people who are a part of 2021 America, and this was the core reason why the movie West Side Story flopped at the box office and only made $10 million. Now, your West Side Story may be a classic for many musical fans, but for today's moviegoer, it is an archaic concept. Now, the whole idea of sharks and jets, yes, that was very relatable back in 1957 when your Spanish Harlem and parts of the Bronx were predominantly filled with ethnic whites like Italians, Jews, and Greeks. But these days, your ethnic whites are not in those neighborhoods anymore. Ask anybody from neighborhoods like Spanish Harlem or the South Bronx, when's the last time they saw a white person living in their neighborhood? And they'll tell you that there aren't that many white people in their neighborhood. So that already was one strike against your West Side Story. The other strike against West Side Story was the fact that the Hispanic community of Spanish Harlem and places like the South Bronx has completely changed. Now, back in the days of the late 50s and 60s, we had a growing Hispanic population, primarily from Puerto Rico. And that was the big group that was a part of the residency here in places like New York City, who lived in places like Spanish Harlem and the South Bronx. But these days, your Latino community is much larger and much more diverse. So these days, you don't just have Puerto Ricans living in places like Spanish Harlem and the South Bronx. No, you have Puerto Ricans, you have Dominicans, you have El Salvadorans, you have Cubans, you have Venezuelans, you have people from numerous Latin countries living here in these neighborhoods, and each person has their own diverse culture and their own diverse viewpoint. And many people in the Latino community who have grown up in these in neighborhoods like Spanish Harlem and the South Bronx, they don't really see a movie as West Side Story as fondly as people in the past did. No, they see your West Side Story as an extremely paternalistic movie and a movie with a lot of racist overtones and undertones. So when they look at West Side Story, they don't see it as something positive. No, they see it as something that breathes a lot of brand new life into old stereotypes about Latinos, who are the biggest minority group here in America. And most Latinos, who are mostly conservative, they frown on a movie like West Side Story because that movie perpetuates some of the worst stereotypes about Latinos to ever grace a cinematic screen. Yes, it was entertaining for whites back in 1961, but in an age of 2021 where your Latinos have their own television networks like Univision and Telemundo and many other cable channels which feature content that is owned by Latinos, it is insulting to all of those Hispanics who make up the Hispanic community for Hollywood to come and then say, oh, we're going to make a remake of West Side Story, because many of those Latinos, they don't see West Side Story as their story, because this story of a white gang member falling in love with the sister, I think, of a Latino gang member, that's something that is stereotypical for many upwardly mobile Latinos who really frown on the whole idea of being associated with these stereotype concepts such as gangs. So many Latinos, they frown on the whole idea of the white person being the person that she's falling, the white woman being the one that the guy is falling in love with, because many Latinos believe in Latino on Latino love, and they believe in having a Latino family all together. That is what many Latinos believe today. And when they see this whole idea of your West Side Story with your sharks and your jets, that's an archaic concept for many Latinos as related to it. Now, your Steven Spielberg, because he's a boomer and he's detached from the pulse of people these days, he thought, oh, this is a good idea to make into a remake. Not understanding that over the last 60 years, the Latino community has changed as Latinos have become the most largest population of minorities here in America. And with Latinos being the largest population of minorities, they have their own media platforms, and they really were not impressed by the whole idea of a West Side Story remake, because they have their own media platforms where they're telling their own stories, and this one just feels so archaic and outdated that it's not something today's Latino community relates to. As somebody who has lived in the South Bronx among Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Dominicans, El Salvadorans, Colombians, and many others, I can tell you that today's Hispanic population, they don't really see West Side Story as fondly as your boomers like Steven Spielberg. No, they even frown on recent concepts like ABC's Ugly Betty. Because I remember I was walking down the street when I was getting meeting up with a family member, and we were talking about how the American Ugly Betty pales in comparison to Betty LaFaya. And a Hispanic woman came to me, a little girl, she came to me and said, and it was a teenage girl actually. She came to me and said, "Yeah, the Ugly Betty from Telemundo or Univision was way better than the ABC version." So many people in the Hispanic community, they will watch their own content and they will put it first before our content, and their content does not really feature a lot of those Hispanic stereotypes that your remakes like West Side Story feature. And your boomers, again, they're afraid of their own mortality, so they continue to try to make these remakes, thinking that they're going out here making something good. But what is happening is that they're finding out that the world is changing, And that's why these movies like your West Side Story remake are bombing at the box office. Now, your Steven Spielberg, he spent over $100 million on this West Side Story remake, and it has only made $10 million at the box office. And the reason why it made $10 million at the box office is because this movie is offensive to many Latinos, I believe, and many Latinos, when they look at this movie, it's really an insult to the Hispanic community to see somebody talking about singing about wanting to live in America, and guys talking about being in gangs. It's a whole bunch of stereotypes, and many Latinos today, they are not aspiring to be in gangs and stuff like that. I mean, there's a small faction like that, but most Latinos are upwardly mobile. Most Latinos are going to school. Most Latinos own businesses. Like here in the Bronx, many of the business owners are Latino. The borough president is a Latino. And we have Hispanics in numerous positions. So this 60-year-old film is basically something that should stay in its time. But your boomers like Steven Spielberg, they want to bring it back to try to relive their past, not understanding that the Hispanic community has changed over time, and because they have not really accepted the changes in the Hispanic community, what they want to do is try to sell this movie and try to pander to Hispanics by going out here and using terms like Latinx. Now, this Latinx term is a term that many of your white leftists have been trying to push as the new term for Latino. But many Latinos, they have really vehemently turned against this whole Latinx narrative, and they will not go along with this because it's an insult to them. Many Latinos look at Latinx as a racist term, and they look at it as a racist term because it is a white person trying to define their heritage and their history and their culture, and they have worked over 60 years to define their own culture on their own platforms. So Hispanics are looking at this Latinx as a way to try to tell them who they are, but you cannot tell people who they are when they own their own media platforms, they own their own publications, and they control their own media and the narratives of their media. So these efforts to push Latinx have been seen as one big insult by many Latinos, and this was part of the marketing plan for West Side Story, and another reason why the West Side Story movie flopped. Now, the whole concept of Latinx, as somebody who's lived among Hispanic community for over 30 years, I can tell you it's a major insult because you're telling people who they are and trying to define who they are, just like the West Side Story movie tried to define who Puerto Ricans were. But they were able to get away with that back then because whites controlled Hollywood and the media, but Hispanics have their own media, and that is why they pushed back against West Side Story, and your West Side Story practically flopped with this remake. These days, the whole concept of a West Side Story is seen by many Latinos as racist and stereotypical, and the whole idea of trying to bring this 60-year-old movie, again, is another example of how your boomers are stuck in the past and how they only want to create media that makes them feel comfortable about where they were during their best years. And they want to bring back all of the media that makes them feel comfortable because many of your boomers know that they're near the last days of their lives and they fear their own mortality. So they want to make media that makes them feel comfortable. Unfortunately, when they make media that makes them feel comfortable, this is one of the reasons why Hollywood is struggling right now. It's just like the days of the late 60s when Hollywood had problems because Hollywood was out here detached from many of the Americans who were dealing with the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement and everything going on. They wanted to go out here and make movies that were comfortable for the greatest generation with all of these World War II movies, all of these epic movies, all of these westerns and all of the media that many who grew up from the 30s to the 50s enjoyed. But kids who had been born in the 40s and 50s, the baby boomers, they were not happy watching that media as people were being blown up in Vietnam, nor were they happy seeing a world that did not look like the world that was going on. And fast forward 60 years later, we have the same problem with many baby boomers like your Steven Spielberg. They don't see how they are just like their grandfathers and their fathers who worked in Hollywood, detached from the audience who wants to see a 2021 world broadcast to them, telling the stories and experiences of people from 2021, not the world of 1961. The world of 1961 was a completely different place, and in the world of 1961, you could get away with producing a West Side Story. Yes, you could get away with that in 1961 because the civil rights movement was only a couple of years old, and we did not have Hispanics coming together to form their own political organizations, or having Hispanics go out here to build their own businesses and their own economic base. So yes, you could get away with making those kinds of movies like West Side Story, or make references to Puerto Ricans in movies like 12 Angry Men. Yes, you could get away with that back then, but today the world is different. And if you're with Hispanics being a large majority of as related to minorities, you're not going to be able to get away with producing that kind of material, and you're not going to be able to get that kind of support at the box office for that type of content. And again, it just shows how detached many in Hollywood are. They're trying to go with a lot of these reboots and remakes, make films that they feel comfortable with from their past, not looking to embrace the future and embrace the stories of people from today. And that's one of the things that's impeding Hollywood, because many of your directors like your Steven Spielberg, they'll spend $100 million on a West Side Story, but they won't go out here and help a young Latino creator make an original story that can resonate with audiences today. If they invested maybe $1 or $2 million in one of these young Latino filmmakers or one of these young Latino screenwriter scripts, I guarantee it would probably make over $100 million. But they don't want to do that like many of the producers did back in the 60s and the 70s, when young filmmakers like Steven Spielberg were looking to get their first break. No, they don't want to go out here and pay it forward, because many boomers are selfish, and many boomers don't want to hand the opportunities that they were given to your Gen Xers and your millennials to go out here and tell the stories that will allow your entertainment industry to remain competitive. No, they want to hold on to the entertainment industry with dear life, and because they want to hold on to the entertainment industry with dear life and not let it go, that's why the entertainment industry is taking all of these huge losses, because they are afraid of taking the risks that your greatest generation and silent generation were forced to in order to adapt and survive. And because these people got everything given to them, they don't know how to adapt and survive, and that's why they continue to try to hold on to archaic concepts like West Side Story, instead of letting them go on to be the classics that they were and seeing them as the period pieces that they were. No, they want to try to bring them back for another generation, not understanding that the place for these kind of films was back in the early 60s, because they were a part of that period, and we need to create brand new classics for this generation to go out here and enjoy. Now, if you want to pick up some of my positive black fiction on the SJS Direct imprint that reflects many of the stories that I believe aren't being told by mainstream media, you can pick up those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBook Store, and Google Play. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.